Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Interact Global, the free virtual edition of Nomensa's Interact conference. A massive thanks to Rui Kuto of OutSystems and Chris Richards of Nomensa for their brilliant talks earlier. Wrapping up today, our final talk joining us from sunny Los Angeles is Bern Irizarry of Sony Pictures with her talk, How to Manage Transitions Creatively, where she'll explore leading change in challenging times, examine change management models, and show how, as a creative leader, she has incorporated change management into both her creative practice and her own life. As always, please do say hello to each other in the chat and join in the discussion. Just make sure your chat settings are switched to panelists and attendees, and that way everyone can see your messages. If there's any issues with the stream or audio, anything like that, please let us know there as well, and we'll try and get that sorted ASAP. Also, if you have a question for Bern, please do submit that using the Q&A box. It should be at the bottom of your Zoom window, and I'll get through as many as I can with these with Bern at the end. Finally, we are using auto-generated captions. Some words may get a little muddled and they're not 100% accurate. However, when we share these talks publicly, we'll make sure they are all correct. So yeah, without further ado, over to you, Bern.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here virtually, spend some time talking a little bit about managing transitions. Just a little bit of background, my history and my nature with change is that I am a street-trained change agent. I'm actually street-trained in most everything that I do. I find it very surprising that I went to school for sculpture and design, but the expectations that people have of me is that I'm going to be excellent and an expert at marketing and sales and communication. And so as I look at my day, I'm here to tell you that sometimes I have imposter syndrome. But there's one place where I don't find myself and where in an imposter mode, but I find myself feeling really at home. And that's in my creative practice. I am equally at home creating sculptures and doing welding, and I love the same level of craft when I'm making a spreadsheet. We're sketching out a plan for a new feature with my team. And as my career has progressed, I've seen the nature of what I'm asked to make change over time. And I moved early in my career from designing digital products. I like to tell everybody I came up when the web was gray, into services, into designing teams, ultimately running my own design consultancy for many years. And now I have the pleasure of helping to craft ecosystems for folks at my current enterprise. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the lessons I learned along the way and how, as a designer, I quite often found myself thinking, products are easy and people are hard. And what I'm going to start with is I'm going to start with a story about a not so great change story, but it had some bonuses. Early in my career, I had the pleasure of working with a really fantastic client. She was someone who had worked on the product side of the business. She is the person who invented things like color selection. So you know how today you can go on your iPhone, you take a picture, and you could paint the wall in your home. She was an innovator. And she invited me to come and help her as she moved into a retailer. And she left the product side and actually went to go work for a large hardware chain. Now, the interesting thing about that was that she said, we're going to reinvent paint. And I was like, okay, that sounds like fun. And as I got into it, I found that we found my first change model. This was early 2000s, so this model was created by John Kotter in 1995. And you may have heard some of these things, but I'm going to tell you how we implemented them, and I'm going to tell you, spoiler alert, the change didn't stick. So one of the first things they always tell you about change management is to create a sense of urgency. So how might you do that as somebody who comes out of creative? Well, my first thing was, there must be an image, a piece of key art that can tell that story. And we did find a really compelling graph. And that graph showed that this company, after the 2000s and the bust, was still going down with its sales, but everyone else in the industry was going up. So that created urgency for everyone in the company, and it became kind of a mantra. We created diagrams with large numbers, so we did, classic Classic Kotter, item number 1. Item number 2, checking it off the list, we created a guiding coalition. Sounds like a sound proposal, and we actually just didn't do it from home office, so to speak, headquarters. We actually went out to all the retailers in this community, and we engaged both skeptics, big retailers, small retailers, and they gave us some great feedback. They were wonderful supporters, and they poked some holes in it and what our ideas were. So that was pretty useful. We created a vision and strategy. We had a 3-year plan, and it was going according to the numbers. And this is where I really found my skills as a designer and a storyteller came into play. We did a lot of communicating about the vision. We created videos. We created backstory. We did research. And we would then deliver that to folks in a variety of ways. We did it on their intranet. We went to their conferences. We visited in stores. So far, everything was going according to plan. And we enabled people to have a different conversation. Suddenly it wasn't, we're going to be a dusty old hardware chain. Now it was, we're going to try new things. We're going to innovate. And we generated some wonderful wins, right? Number 6, off the list. We were high rated in consumer magazines that rated paint. People were excited to see the product coming out. A lot of good things. We were getting press. But we were 3 years in, and the change happened to us. It happened to our program. We didn't get to consolidate the gains, and we didn't get to do any new approaches because there was a change in the leadership. So even though my client was the president of her division, when the then CEO, who was her big supporter, left, she became disenfranchised by new leadership. She ended up leaving the company after having done some tremendous change. Store over, probably 3,000 locations were redesigned. She helped to change the way they manufacture. But when she left, all of that change evaporated and their position disappeared. And for me, who had just started her own firm and one of the biggest eggs in her little design consultancy basket, well, I had a reckoning to deal with of my own because I had to respond to that change. So as I reflect back on this, and it was early in my career, I was probably in my early 30s, I had defaulted to the things that I knew, right? We made things. I was a maker, right? I made campaigns, and I made plans, and I did research, and products, and packaging, and all of that was fine. The issue for me, though, as I talk to you today, is to recognize that a change didn't stick because we didn't do 2 important things. We didn't recognize that change is really hard, right? And that at the end of the day, it's not going to be linear. So while we were checking everything and we were doing a planned change, we weren't sticking our heads up enough, getting feedback from the field as to what was happening. Now, it could be that, unfortunately for my client, maybe she didn't realize that change was in the wind and that her major supporter was going to disappear. But I invite you, as you take up your change practice, to recognize that it's not going to go the way you imagine, and that over planning and not being responsive in today's day and age, it is dangerous. The other thing I don't know that we did nearly enough is design for adoption. And what do I mean by that? I mean that when we introduce new products and technology, or a new process, right, we'll spend a lot of time journey mapping, figuring out the emotions, blueprinting what a customer is going to go through. But when we're designing those technologies, we're not necessarily looking at with the same level of detail, and I'm not saying for everyone, I'm saying of the places that I've seen, with the same level of detail of journey work internally. I like to say that I'm at a media and entertainment company, and we tell stories for a living, and we tell them really wonderfully. But sometimes we don't tell them enough to each other, and we don't do that work. So when you are putting together your product, and particularly if you work on internal tools or enablement for your company, think about and take those same, what I'll call B2C tactics, and apply them to your company. Apply them and put them into B2B or B2E so that it's meaningful. The one that I also talked about was feedback loops. We clearly did not spend enough time gathering information. We had started, we met with our guiding coalition, every other month, but we needed to be more consistent, right? We really needed to go beyond just the informational report out and instead create metrics that were more consistent and create a team that was going to monitor how we were doing, right? So taking more regular pulse checks and really making sure that it was not just our retailers, but we were looking across the organization, because while we had a lot of support in the field, at home office, I don't know that we had the same support. So as I kind of reflect back on that change early in my career, I realized that while the mechanics of change were something that I understood, we're going to do this communication, we're going to have this plan, we're going to work with this team to implement this packaging, we really didn't solve for the change in the mindset shift that was required. And one of the things, or one of my favorite next kind of tool that I'll give you, is from William Bridges. And his whole book is called Managing Transitions. And he says, isn't the changes that do you in, it's the transition. And I'm going to tell you now about my kind of second big change moment. And this is where I had to lead an Agile transformation. So I was part of a really fantastic team. This time, I had learned my lesson, I thought. I did learn some lessons. And we had a lot going for us in terms of the columns that said, this is probably going to be successful, right? We had support at the highest levels, at the C level of the organization. This time, we were not just, doing it as our own, as a product team with some really smart individuals. There was an actual Agile management office. We worked in concert with a large consulting firm who had done Agile transformations before. And, we started with a really compelling premise that we were out there in the world and that our devs and our tech teams, we needed to become more competitive because the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google, were coming for our lunch. And we needed to be out there, okay? So all said and good, I was like, all right, this time I'm going to do it differently. And, we did. I knew what the payoff would be if we did it right. I also know that if we didn't do it correctly, all the hard work, the investment, those, consulting hours, that was going to, we were not only going to lose market position, we would have spent a lot of money and disappointed a lot of people. So again, this is William Bridges' book, but I'm going to tell you the big difference and the takeaway that I got from this book was that he talks about change being situational, right? Change is something that happens to you, right? And change could be as simple as, maybe you're a developer and your technology, the tech stack is sunset and you have to move to another one, right? We see that happening a lot with Angular, right? Maybe you're moving to a new office. Change is happening to you. And now your commute is longer than it was, right? We know clearly the pandemic changed a lot of lives for a lot of people, but maybe you've seen your manager or your mentor move to another company. So change can be positive for that person, different for you. You might be getting a new job. You might be buying a new flat or having a baby. Change impacts us and it comes at us in ways that are different than transition. And what Bridges would say about transition is that psychological change that has to happen. It's the thing that I think I missed on my first go around the change wheel. And that there are 3 phases that he talks about that move people through transition. So I'm going to share a little bit of those with you. Okay? So let's look at each of these phases. And what's interesting is that with change, he says you start from the end and work back. So you go, here's the outcome that I want, and this is how I'm going to get there. Do a work back schedule. He argues with transitions, you actually start with endings. And the biggest thing you have to begin with is helping people understand that you're letting something go. You're losing something. And this is where people have to let go of the old identity. And what we often find is organizations rush through that loss. Okay? So we'll talk a little bit more about some tactics, but I just want to sit there for a minute, right? He's saying ultimately, like, this emotional moment of you creating new identity is something that for many organizations and people, they just want to get past, right? He then says, okay, Once you have gone through there, the next place you're going to move is the neutral zone. And the thing about the neutral zone is as it's described. I like to think of it like Daenerys going across the desert, right? You're just in there, you're in this kind of place. It could be opportunity, you're getting to the city. It could be that it's not going to work out, you're in between, right? And what happens in that neutral zone is it's a moment for you to kind of repattern. The old is gone, and you're trying to suss out the new, but it's not fully online yet. It's not operational. Now, after you get through the neutral zone, he talks about the new beginning. And this is where people are like, okay, I'm ready to move away from transition, and I'm ready to embrace this new identity. There can be energy, there can be a sense of purpose. But how quickly people move through those phases is going to vary based on individual and the nature of the change being asked. So I said very early on that the idea of the letting go phase, the basic risk that we see is that quite often people try to move through it so fast that either the individuals who are asked to participate in that change are behind, or you gloss over the change, and what happens is you have residual effects. People haven't really let go of the old identity. That can lead to people being unwilling or resistant, and I would argue quite often that resistance is really not having had that moment to let go, to grieve that loss. So how do you approach letting go? All right, so let's imagine a world where my design team is being merged with another design team. And I need to understand what's going to happen for all of my designers and my creative directors and art directors. So what might I do to prepare for that? Well, I would argue that the tools that I already have as somebody who is a UXer and a creative are going to come into play. The first thing I need to do is I really need to identify who is losing what. Okay, so in my example, I might do a stakeholder map. I might do an empathy map to really get behind what's happening for my designers, what's happening for my creative directors. What about these people who are coming in from the other design team? And what might second or third order effects of that change be? Okay, one of the things we found when we did our Agile transformation was that there was a sense of middle managers, especially, that they were kind of this frozen middle, and what they felt they were losing was control, because Agile and the Agile Manifesto was saying didn't have a place for those managers in the map, and it was all about the team making decisions. So they felt, I'm losing control. How am I losing my path to success? Okay, now one of the things I can say is I'm like, no, that's not going to be a problem. There's ways for you to coach, and I could do all that. But I needed to understand when you're dealing with that letting go, that loss is subjective. It's seen through my filter. And so when I want to deal with it, I'm going to call upon the facilitation skills that I use. So what might happen when somebody's having a reaction, I'm going to rely on my ability to be like a researcher and really just be with that person and connect, create that empathy. But at the same time, I need to recognize that I might be having many reactions. I use my facilitation skills to take a stance so that I can be curious about it. Now, sometimes when a change is coming and you really want people to get on board because you've been letting go for several months, let's be honest, sometime as a leader, you're going to know a change is coming before you can tell your team. And then, you might find, or people may find themselves tempted to argue with what you hear. No, it's going to be fine. No, I don't understand. You're overreacting. And I'll tell you, I had team members tell me that the folks we were talking to were overreacting. And that was something we had to have a conversation with as an Agile team, because what they considered an overreaction was we wanted to approach that with curiosity, right? Because we cannot walk in another person's shoes, and really that judgment of you're overreacting wasn't going to help our situation, and definitely wasn't beneficial to the individuals who are having stress. Now, one of the things that we need to recognize is that letting go is also recognizing that there's discomfort and that people are losing something. So how might you compensate people for what that lost thing is? And yes, there are if you're doing a restructure, quite often you'll have severance packages and the things of that nature. But compensating people for their loss is not always about a financial payout, right? It could be a way of returning somebody to status. It could be a way of allowing people to be still seen as expert and having value. You know, one of the things my mentor often says is that most people don't come to work to do a bad job. So something is going on there, and you want to get to the bottom of that. Another thing that we ended up doing in the letting go is people are like, oh, do we need to tell them again what the change is? They know. And I would argue, yes, you may have said it, and you may need to say it multiple times, right? Which is that at the end of the day, people are processing, and they might hear it, then they might forget it, they might be stressed. And that repetition of what's going on, what's actually changing, is important for them to hear, right? And I often say, and this is something we had to do very explicitly for those managers that I described to you, is we needed to define what was over and what was continuing, right? So the big thing, they're like, well, who's going to do, if the team runs itself, who's going to do their performance review? If the team runs itself and I have a bunch of junior people, what's going to happen? Am I just supposed to let them flounder, right? And so we had to have a different conversation about the change, right? We had to say, all right, you're transitioning into this new way of coaching and leading a team, right? You're still going to be doing those activities. This is what that looks like. Here's how your span and layers might change based on our conversation today, right? One of the other things you have to be conscious of as you put together a kind of something that's going to impact teams is that you want to be conscious of burnout, because if you don't make explicit what people should keep doing versus what they should stop doing, they might end up doing all of it, and then they burn out, they leave, they're exhausted, and you lose some of your best people, because those are the folks who will leave first, right? The last two I kind of grouped together, and I put into that category of symbols. And for me, one of the things that is a temptation is to go, the old way of doing things was crummy. This is going to be so much better, right? And what that risk is that there's somebody who had their identity and who valued that other way of doing things, right? So you want to respect the past. If the past had some issues and it wasn't the strength that you wanted, what you can do is show how the alternative is better. You could have someone else. So let's imagine you had a problem in your customer service group and you're restructuring that to make it more effective. What you may do is take that team to go and see a high functioning customer service group. You may have a client and have them listen in to a client talking about how things aren't working, okay? So you want to respect the past and look at different ways to deliver the message of what was wrong. And then you want to mark the ending, because it's important. If you've decided we're transforming, we're doing a restructure, we're going to grow our team, we're going to get new roles, there's a reason that ending is important, and you want to mark it. You don't want to run away from the ending, okay? So a couple of lessons I'll leave you with on this. Start with the ending. Respect it. Don't rush over it. Recognize and let people, and with empathy, I understand this is a change and it's impacting you, right? Avoid the avoid the impetus to avoid. I guess that's right. Not communicating about what's going on isn't going to help, right? Calling out the importance of what is happening and the need to move forward is really valuable. And one of the things some people want to do is that they don't want to talk about it. They want to say it once and then, kind of sweep it under the rug. The problem with not talking about it or acknowledging it is that there are those who can grow in resentment because they think you're not voicing the problem. Or there are those who may feel unseen or scared. So having that direct conversation is really valuable. We talked a little bit about using ceremony and symbols, right? And I want to remind folks that as they're doing this, right, sometimes people want to take a little history with them, because that change of a chapter, it could be something you as an organization want to recognize, right? So maybe you're moving from one building to another, or you're closing down your small office because you've gone from being this, incredible startup, and you're just growing into a new place. One of the things we did when I was in an internet startup is we had this really janky, we had this really terrible server situation with all kinds of duct tape. But when we went to the new building, because we grew, we turned that into art, and it became a symbol from us for moving from this place to becoming a more serious company. So celebrate and look for those symbols as you're making transitions happen. And again, you can draw on your knowledge of pace layers or just recognize that people move at different speeds. And quite often the folks who are in design roles and what have you, or technical innovators, we're people who can sometimes really feed on change. And if you're the person who's driving that change, you're going to know more than everybody else. And you may already be through your transition, and there might be some people who are still processing. Okay? So we've talked a little bit about ending, losing, and letting go. So now let's talk about the neutral zone. So that kind of middle layer. We said it was, I'm out in the desert. I'm figuring out if I'm going to make it to, the promised land or what have you. Well, in the neutral zone, people are trying to figure out what their new patterns are going to be. And the issue that they have is that everything may not be hardened yet. So what does that mean? Well, that can create anxiety for some folks because not everybody likes to be in flux. Some people are really looking for concrete change. And so that idea that it's going to get worse can become a huge fear for folks. Like I said, they can become overloaded. And so what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about what happens when you deal with reorganizations or letting people go. One of the things that is really at risk in the neutral zone is because people are anxious, it can create discord on the team. Hopefully you don't have people outwardly fighting, but there can be some rise in people's energy and overall gritchiness, so to speak. So let's talk about what happens in the neutral zone. So one of the things that we did very effectively in some of the reorganizations that I've been involved with is kind of normalizing the fact that you're moving from one identity to another. So perhaps your role has changed, whereas formerly you were a manager of the customer service department, now you're a customer success manager and you're expected to do different things. You're expected to be more front of house. Maybe you're an art director who has now moved into a different role where you are going to become a researcher, right? Understanding that identity that you had may have changed, right? And normalizing that it's okay to be confused or to be a little bit frightened, okay? You would also want to do is have a conversation that helps people regain balance, right? Understanding what forces are impacting them, and maybe look for things that might, in this in-between time, be opportunities for them to invent. Because the great thing about the neutral zone is you have this moment where you can leave the past behind. So things that were off limits, because that's not done here, are now open. And that innovation can motivate people. Now, one of the things that we saw, particularly, and this is true of Agile transformations, is that quite often people are kind of chasing that Sutherland 2x, 3x productivity will come as a result of this transformation. It will be amazing. It's important not to overpromise, particularly when you're in the neutral zone, because research has shown people's productivity will dip, right? You may also want to look at your team and ask, do they need some skills? Because maybe you have a really fantastic engineer, really fantastic, but they haven't had to deal with a lot of facilitation skills, right? They've had small teams and now you're asking them to lead large groups. What are the things you can do to help your engineer who's now going to be doing meetings that are 30 people, 40 people, drive decision making, right? So think about the skills that people might need to make it through the neutral zone, particularly your leaders who are going to be that face of change and on the ground doing things with people. The neutral zone can also be really lonely for people, right? Because everyone may find themselves feeling like, oh, I must be the only person feeling this way, or I'm really confused and I don't understand why my company would change in this fashion, right? Think about ways to bring folks together so they don't isolate. We've all seen the nature of how isolation is impacting us. We're social beings as a result of last year. And then another thing you really want to be conscious of is being fair and consistent, Because if you are seen in your transition as favoring one group or one thing over another, it can send people out, and what can happen is they will potentially gravitate to those who are either negative or against the change, and they can be soured, or you could lose some of your best folks. Okay, so what is the lesson about the neutral zone that we really want to take away? Right, use the new and this in-between time to experiment. Right, give people permission, go try things, figure out a way forward, create temporary positions that elevate them and give them back some status as they're figuring this out. And also perhaps their short-term goals, so that you can replace some of that previous identity with new things that can motivate and show achievement. I talked about not overpromising so that we avoid people burning out and growing connections. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about being in the neutral zone. Okay, now we're ready to go into that new beginning. So as a creative, I love beginnings. I love making stuff. I love a fresh piece of paper, right? I just dig that kind of stuff. And I know that I'm probably an annoying person to deal with. Because some people, they're like, I don't know about beginnings. I kind of want it. But, there's a risk of failure. That's not somewhere I want to go, Bern. And I'm like, but it's going to be great. Right? So kind of recognize that not everyone's going to come at it the same way you are. Or I am. Because maybe you're different than me. I probably are. There's a thing that I really like that Bridget's put forward. It's a real easy memory trick, right? The 4 Ps. Communicate the purpose and the outcome of what you seek. You're going to say, but Bern, we kind of talked about that in the end. We kept talking about that when we first started, where we were trying to go. Well, now it's the time, again, to reinforce it. What does it look like? Why are we doing this, right? To compete with the FANGs meaningfully, to ensure that we can go from that plucky startup into being a company that services this particular segment of people better than others. Changing the way in which people educate, right? Change is also happening in organizations that are not necessarily commercially driven, right? Same kind of problems. You can also give people a picture of how it could look and feel. And this is something that you do as a creative all the time, or as a technology person, right? As an engineer, you might be creating prototypes, you might have inspirations. Help people see that, right? Help them understand what that looks like, Now, I told you that you don't want to overplan, but you do want to be thinking about what are the messages and feedback loops, the things I'm going to be responding to that are helping them move into this new beginning. One of the things I've done when I've had to do restructures is I literally plan out, because usually it's not happening overnight. You're working with your HR folks, right? There's a concerted effort in figuring out what that is. But I'll have, a weekly and a monthly plan that is kind of mapping what I think their journey might be. And I list the messages we're going to be talking about. What are the new things I am saying our department's going to become? Yeah? And then I make sure that everybody has a part to play. Because if I'm the only one driving the change, we heard about my hardware retailer, I haven't involved anybody. The minute I leave, that change is over. Or even worse, because I'm the only one who's excited about it, it doesn't stick, it doesn't even take root. Okay? So the 4 Ps, purpose, picture, plan, and play. So as we talk about, what are the takeaways for new beginnings, let's talk about, lesson number 9, right? Be consistent with those 4 Ps. Celebrate some of the things that are going to make people excited, right? Maybe the same way you created exiting symbols, right? And, I have one here. This is a great symbol. Are there ways that unify your team? I don't know if you folks are familiar with challenge coins, right? This is something I received from an information security team that I was working with. And, it was something that after you had been through a process together, they would give you. Now, you also can, obviously, you go out drinking, and if you don't have your coin, then you have to pay for the drinks, so bring your coin. But I think the more important message is that it was something that unified and something that we all knew that we had been through something together because I had this coin. And then I think you want to also celebrate and I know this is a strange statement to put here, but put on your mask first. And what I mean by that is remember that if you don't take care of yourself, you cannot take care of others. And, epilogue on this one, I've taken you through those 3 transitions, but for me, this year has been a very interesting one, where I actually went into enterprise after having had an agency for 20 years. And I will tell you, that was a big transition, and I'm still not completely through it. I really am in the neutral zone. I love everything about the place that I am at, but that was my identity, right? Being, Bern CEO of Velvet Hammer Design, it takes a while for that transition to happen. So what are some of the things I'm doing to take care of myself? Well, I'm speaking up more, having this conversation. Well, I'm not having this conversation with you folks yet, but there are people who I'm talking to and kind of saying, here's what this is going to be. And what I like to say is that bravery is a muscle, right? Vulnerability and going out there and really practicing what's happening for you and kind of raising your voice, whether you're leading the change or you're somebody who's receiving it, is an important thing that everyone can be practicing. I rely a lot on others. I like to say that transitions are a team sport, not only because you get that connection of somebody else who's trying to solve for it with you, but it helps to have multiple perspectives. We understand and we are having better conversations about how diverse voices and viewpoints really do lead for greater collaboration and conversation, because there are things that people can raise to you. And I think, bringing other people into that fold with me as I'm figuring out things, those who make the plan with you don't fight the plan, which is a useful thing. So use that, the things that we know, co-creating and collaboration. Take those design skills, those creative and engineering skills, and put them to work here. One of my favorites is storytelling. I recently put a class together on storytelling through data. And I think the interesting thing is we all hear about the neuroscience that says we are wired for story. And that story essentially is the means by which, we evolved so that we didn't have to get eaten by the lion. I could tell you a story that said stay away from that bush because a lion likes to hang out there, and you didn't have to take that risk. Now, most of us are not in a position where a lion is outside our door, but the emotional risk, the psychological risk around career and pride and what's happening for you, those are important things to be conscious of. So as you're telling yourself stories and you're telling your peers stories, use the tricks of the trade. There's great books out there. I'm happy to suggest them, but understanding how you create your audience, your team as the protagonist in a story, and a plot and messaging becomes a real value add. And you know what? You're pitching all day. I'm guessing you're trying to convince people of your ideas. This should be a muscle that you continue to strengthen. And then finally, I would say, remember your own power. You have the ability to make things. And you too, like me, are probably more street trained in change than you think. And so I hope that you've enjoyed this conversation today. I hope that we'll have some great questions, and that as you go out and you manage transitions, what I've provided is of service. Thanks, everybody.
Amazing. Thank you, Bern. Yeah, no, I love that. I think just about everyone can probably relate to the aches and pains of change and transitions to change, especially over the last 2 years when literally everything changed.
Everything changed. If anyone needed that.
But yeah, now if anyone has any questions, please do submit them now using the Q&A box. And I will. I can see one in the chat already. But yeah, Bern, I mean, how do you kind of prepare yourself personally for change? Are there kind of any rituals or kind of things kind of you do?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things that I like to do. I have one of my favorite books. Is actually by John Couch. He's over at Hulu. He's a creative director. And this book is called The Art of Creative Rebellion. And there's a couple of things I do, right? I read this book because he talks about how you move through the world with confidence and what it means to be creative and make your own way and have conversations. So I revisit my values as I go into change. I also like to spend time actually doing a lot of sketching personally and doing mind mapping for myself of what I think I'm up for, because sometimes getting it out of my brain and onto paper will help me to have other conversations and stimulate questions. So I'm a big mapper. I miss whiteboards. I have to be honest, I'm really looking forward to that again. I figured out how to do it on my iPad, but there's clearly not enough surface area. And then I think my final thing is, and I've been tapping into this a lot over the last year and a half, is I reach out to my trusted cohort, my board members, my personal board members, because I'm nervous, right? I'm impacting people's lives. I want to do that with respect and grace and kindness and curiosity, and they keep me honest when I'm being an idiot, because sometimes they get frustrated. They kind of call me out, which is always good. My husband really enjoys that. But those are some of the things I like to do.
Brilliant, thank you. So we got a question here that asks, can you give any more tips on driving change in health behavior?
Oh yeah, sure. I think when people are thinking about, do I want to be healthier with exercise or take care of myself or stress? Personally, I can tell you I'm really at risk for overworking. A couple of things that I like folks to think about is there's a process called stacking, right? And what that basically means is you make one small change, you get that in place, and then you add a change on top of it. So it could be, let's imagine you want to get up and move more. You might decide that every time you pass through a door, you're going to do some extra movement. Or perhaps you are struggling with anxiety and tension in your body. How might you do something that you know you're going to do every day to stack it with another practice? So that can be through setting yourself. One of the things that I like to do is to set a little reminder for yourself to meditate, to breathe, to get up, to walk around. I had someone who was, she worked really late. She was a night owl. And so instead of creating a reminder to wake up, she created a bell to go to sleep. So use technology and stacking to drive some of those behaviors that you want to change. And I think there's a lot of great communities as well. I personally thrive when I do something in concert with people. So I like buddy systems personally when I'm trying to take on health challenges.
Awesome, thank you. No, those are awesome tips. So kind of related to that as well, Bob in the chat saying it's just kind of pointing out these pointers be kind of really useful in terms of kind of transitioning kind of mental health and kind of and he's kind of asking if he can share this talk with health trusts. I'm sure we can. That's fine. We'll have the recording online before the end of the week. So yeah.
When we talk about health and change, I had the honor of working with one of the local hospitals here in Los Angeles, and they were servicing gay men in the BIPOC community. And one of the things that I think is really interesting and to learn from is to go cross-category, where folks who are already dealing with belonging issues and coming out to their families and losing that support system then find themselves at greater risk in other places. So one of the things I like people to think about is, can I look to these organizations who quite often have resources to help me think things through? So I really think there are some wonderful services out there and organizations that have far better knowledge on how to take people through difficult situations. And I always do like to connect people with really go to the experts.
Awesome, thank you. So, but I mean, there's kind of a lot of kind of buzzwords around change management. Like, is there kind of any advice for people wanting to kind of cut through the kind of buzzword noise?
Yes. As someone who has probably unfortunately been a person who's helped to contribute to buzzwords as part of my marketing career, particularly around branding, I'm very angry with myself. I think plain speak is much better. You may hear VUCA, right? Volatile, uncertainty, complex, ambiguity. There's a lot of buzzwords. what I like to do when I am thinking about change is to kind of recognize that a lot of the models have commonalities, and that as long as I've kind of perused them, I can turn them into the practice that works for me. Because I think a model is created by somebody to explain complexity. And if you haven't seen the Understanding Groups class on models, it is phenomenal. In fact, yeah, I have some of their cards here on my desk. It's one of my favorite tools ever. They have these cards about making models. You should really, it's just a fabulous tool. So it's their Clear Models framework, right? But a framework is still something that's been created by somebody, right? So understanding and looking at other models and looking for that difference is helpful. And then I say part of it is make little bets. Try that framework, see if it works, do an experiment, learn from it, and go on. Now, when you have big changes, big transitions and restructures, you may not experiment as hard as you might, but there might be a component, something you can pilot to check if that's going to land, right? So those are some of the things I do when evaluating models in general, because, everything has been created from someone's perspective. So I like to have a healthy love and skepticism about all models, really, because they were made by somebody like me.
Oh, thank you. Do you have another question here that says, I like how this could be applied in enhancing customer/user experience. Any advice you can give on making customer is there any advice you can give on making customers kind of seal the deal / gain high compliance?
Oh, compliance. I remember I had a stakeholder who really wanted us to come up with another word for compliance. He really hated that word. But I think there's a couple of things. One is, okay, so I'm going to make up a story. I don't know if the person wants to add kind of a little more context, but I know and have done a lot of work with information security, right? These are lovely people that I've gotten to work with. And, getting people to comply with the right behavior so that they don't get hurt out on the web is not easy, right? Because they're like, oh my gosh, really? You want me to put in my password 2 times and then I forget it, right? There's that kind of resistance. I got to get my work done. I need to use this tool. It's faster, it's better. And so ways in which I've tried to solve for the compliance is, one, I do use storytelling a lot. And I think there's nothing more compelling than seeing what happens when things go wrong. And I've seen some really effective presentations where people show a hack live and they will basically demo it for folks. So part of it is showing the reality in as safe a way as you can of what bad looks like. I think understanding what motivates your particular groups is going to be important as well. So depending on the behavior that you're trying to have people comply with, I'm going down a documentation path. One of the things you want to think about is, I don't want to use fear. That's not something that I want to create in people. But also know that some people, no matter how you try, aren't going to like the change. But as long as they respect the change, you can kind of get there. And so for me, it's a mix of story. It's a mix of understanding what motivates them. Is it, being recognized by their leader, being recognized by their team? Is it peer pressure, right? You're the last person. And sometimes, I don't want to say it's public shaming. That doesn't ever sound good. But it's being aware and visible with not being in compliance, right? Because sometimes if you don't put it out there, if that's what motivates someone, being seen in that position is like, oh wow, someone's going to know that I didn't do the thing I'm supposed to do. I better do it as much as I don't want to. So those are some ways I've dealt with it. I like to go from soft to hard if I can. I don't like to come in like the hammer if I don't need to, but it's kind of a progressive working backward. And I think it's also a preparing of yourself that the thing that you're usually asking for compliance to happen around is the right thing, right? So for example, if we don't do these things because our application is we have Sarbanes-Oxley in the States, right? If we don't do these things and we get audited, we're going to lose time, money, potentially our autonomy, because people aren't going to trust us to do the thing that we need to do. So, okay, we need to do that. And you need to be okay with having that conversation openly, because there's nothing wrong with your expectation. It's when we're like, oh, I'm begging you. No, this is a thing that needs to be done. So sometimes it's steeling yourself to be the deliverer of that message.
Amazing. Thank you, Bern. Finally, you mentioned there being some really good books out there on storytelling.
Yes.
Are there any kind of you'd like to recommend? I mean,
Yeah.
we're more than happy to share a kind of reading list with.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple. There's one by a woman named Lisa Cron called Wired for Story. I really like it quite a bit because it is really going through how the neuroscience behind the choices you make. It's written for writers, so there's a lot of conversation about protagonists, conflict, how you can bring to your story what I would call some of the more writerly arts to tell compelling messages internally. So that's Lisa Cron, Wired for Story. I am a big fan of Nancy Duarte's work. So if you haven't read her book, Slideology, Resonate is particularly about storytelling. You may be familiar with her TED Talk. She literally has mapped and created a visualization that shows you great speeches. So she's looked at like the Martin Luther King speech. She's looked at Steve Jobs' TED Talk. And she kind of talks about the shapes and the aspects that make stories strong. She also has a really great one called Data Story, which is super helpful when you want to really figure out how to tell the right story and analyze what graphics and how even to structure your arguments based on different types of audiences. Because the way I should tell a story, and I think many of us who do pitches, the way I'm going to tell a story to that SVP or that C-level person because she is time poor is different than the conversation I can have with my manager, who might expect me to tell a story with more supports because basically their social capital is on the line, so they want to make sure I did the homework, to the conversation I should have with my peer. So I'll happy to send you a couple of my favorite links. I've come across some good stories. And then, I hope that you enjoy those.
Awesome, thank you. So yeah, I mean, if anyone thinks of kind of any more questions, I'm sure they can kind of reach out to you on Twitter or LinkedIn.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You'll see that I need to change and transition my LinkedIn. I'm going to try. This is my push, this talk, helping me to transition. Thank you.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, and we can. Yeah, and we'll share that reading list as well. Thanks to everyone that tuned in. We're back tomorrow, where the theme is all about innovation and creativity. We've got talks from Emily Trotter, illustrator here at Nomensa, Lisa Reeves of HSBC, and Liz Huber and Diana Sonifs of CX by Design. So yeah, we will see you back then. There's still time to sign up, so please do that. And again, thank you, Bern. And yeah, we'll see everyone tomorrow. Thank
Bye
you.
bye.